In the spring of 1842, a carriage departed London under deceptive sunny skies. Inside was 20-year-old Lady Marigold Veramont, sold by her own father to seal a business deal. She was on her way to wed a man she had never met, a ruthless industrialist rumored to have dispatched his previous wives with poison. She believed she was riding toward her death, but miles outside the city, on a dust-choked highway, the carriage ground to a halt. It wasn't a highwayman who blocked the road. It was the most enigmatic and commanding duke in England, Alaric Vesey, and he didn't come to save her. He came to seize her for his own justice. "You're under my protection now," he declared. This is the scandalous hidden tale of Corvane Manor. Welcome, dear listeners. Before we dive deeper into this tale of hearts and highways, let me share a funny secret. My granny swears that if we hit 1,000 subscribers, the dukes and ladies in these stories will start sharing their own secrets with us, maybe even a recipe for avoiding bad marriages. So hit that like button if you're hooked already, subscribe to the channel to keep these romances rolling, and drop in the comments where you're listening from. It helps us spread more thrilling tales your way. London, April 1842. The sunlight in London does not always bring warmth. Sometimes it only illuminates the cracks in the plaster. That was the only thought occupying Lady Marigold Veramont's mind as she stared out of the drawing-room window of her father's townhouse. The house was unnervingly still, the air stagnant with the dust of a fading legacy. The only sound was the scratching of a quill against a heavy ledger from the desk behind her. "Stop pacing, Marigold," her father, the Viscount, muttered. He did not look up. He was a man worn thin by excess, hunched over his desk as if the weight of his debts were physically crushing him. "Sir Reginald's agent will be here within the hour. You will not look like a tragic heroine. You will look like a Viscount's dutiful daughter." "I look like a line of credit, father," Marigold said, her voice steady despite the cold dread settling in her stomach. She turned to face him, the sunlight catching her glossy dark chestnut hair and the tension in her graceful neck. "That is what I am, isn't it? An asset to balance your books." The Viscount slammed the quill down, ink spattering the mahogany. "You are naive. Sir Reginald Beaumont is a titan of industry. He owns the very ships that keep this country afloat. You will live in luxury." "Except for safety," Marigold countered, her large, expressive dough-brown eyes narrowing. "They say his last wife died foaming at the mouth, father, and the one before that simply withered away. I am being sent to a graveyard, not a bridal suite." "You are being sent to save our name." The Viscount stood, his face flushed with the desperate anger of a man cornered by his own vices. "Do you think I have a choice? The bailiffs are watching the street, Marigold. If Beaumont does not absorb my debts today, I go to Marshalsea prison by sunset. Would you see your father rot in a debtor's cell?" Marigold looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the tremble in his hands, not from fear for her, but fear for himself. She realized then that in the eyes of the law, she was property, but in the eyes of her father, she was merely currency. But what if the Duke's protection hides a darker secret, one that could shatter Marigold's fragile hope? Marigold stood amidst the wreckage of her father's dignity, her silence ringing louder than his shouting. Her graceful neck remained unbowed, though her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her skin. In the harsh afternoon light, her large, expressive dough-brown eyes held a shimmering resolve that belied the terror gripping her heart. She smoothed a stray lock of glossy, dark chestnut hair, which had fallen in elegant disarray during their confrontation, and finally nodded. It was a gesture of surrender, not to him, but to the crushing reality of their world. Within the hour, the heavy front door opened to admit Mr. Llewellyn, Sir Reginald's agent. He was a man of sharp angles and sour dispositions, holding a pocket watch as if counting the seconds of Marigold's remaining freedom. She stepped out into the deceptive spring sunshine, the air thick with the scent of coal smoke and horse manure. As she climbed into the dark carriage, she pressed her hand against the folds of her skirt, feeling the cold metal of a silver locket hidden within a secret pocket. It was the only possession she had managed to conceal from the inventory of assets, a small, defiant anchor to a past that had not yet been sold. As the carriage lurched forward, jolting over the cobblestones, Marigold refused to look back at the townhouse. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the suffocating velvet interior of the coach. The transaction was complete. In the eyes of the law, she was no longer a person, but a transfer of liability. The legal doctrine of coverture loomed over her like a shroud. A woman had no legal identity separate from her father, and soon she would have none separate from a husband she feared. She was merely collateral used to balance a ledger, her body and future traded to absolve a gambling debt that was never hers to begin with. Mr. Llewellyn sat opposite her, silent as a grave marker, his eyes occasionally flicking toward her with calculating indifference. The city slowly bled into the countryside, the dense buildings giving way to open fields and twisting roads. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels seemed to whisper the rumors of Sir Reginald's previous wives, women who had vanished into the silence of his northern estate, leaving only whispers of poison and madness in their wake. Marigold shivered despite the warmth of the day and glanced out the window seeking distraction. Her breath hitched. Far behind them, cutting through the haze of road dust, a solitary figure rode on horseback. The rider sat tall and imposing, keeping a precise distance that felt deliberate. He moved not with the casual gait of a traveler, but with the predatory focus of a hunter stalking his quarry. As the carriage rounded a bend near a darkening copse of trees, the rider spurred his black steed faster, closing the gap with terrifying speed. Marigold gripped her locket until her knuckles turned white. This was no chance encounter. Something dangerous was thundering toward them, and there was nowhere left to run. The carriage jolted violently, the sudden screech of iron wheels against stone throwing Marigold from her seat. Outside, the horses screamed in protest, their panicked whinnies cutting through the afternoon silence. Mr. Llewellyn scrambled for the pistol beneath his coat, his face draining of color. Highwaymen were a common plague on these isolated stretches of road, lawless opportunists who cared little for titles or contracts. But when the door was wrenched open, it was not a ragged bandit who filled the frame, but a figure of terrifying nobility. Alaric Vesey, the Duke of Corvane, blocked out the sun. He was a man of commanding stature, his broad shoulders stretching the seams of a riding coat that had seen hard travel. Thick coal-black hair fell over a strong, furrowed brow, framing eyes of pale ice gray that seemed to burn with a cold, frantic intensity. He did not look at the trembling agent. His gaze was fixed solely on Marigold. "Step down, Lady Marigold," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the carriage floorboards. "This woman is the property of Sir Reginald Beaumont," Llewellyn squeaked, brandishing his weapon with a shaking hand. "We have a bill of sale." Alaric's sand moved faster than Marigold could follow. He disarmed the agent with a brutal efficiency, tossing the pistol into the mud. "Sir Reginald's markers have been called in," Alaric sneered, producing a crumpled piece of parchment stamped with a military seal. "A debt of honor from the peninsula, one he thought buried in the war. I have purchased his liabilities. You are relieved of your charge." Marigold watched the exchange with breath held tight in her chest. She understood instantly the hierarchy at play. On the King's highway, the law was often secondary to the sheer, crushing weight of social rank. A duke's authority was absolute, eclipsing the claims of a mere industrialist. Llewellyn, realizing he was outmatched by blood and breeding, shrank back into the upholstery, abandoning her without a second glance. "You are under my protection now," Alaric declared, extending a gloved hand. It was not a request. Marigold took it, her skin burning at the contact, and was hoisted from the carriage. She was transferred to his waiting coach, a vehicle bearing the crest of a wolf rampant, darker and more imposing than the one she had left. As they sped away, leaving Llewellyn stranded in the dust, Marigold studied the Duke's profile. He offered no comfort, only a grim, silent vigil. The journey passed in a blur of fear until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the landscape. The carriage slowed as they approached a wrought iron gate. Ahead, rising from the mist like a jagged tooth, stood Corvane Manor. It was a sprawling Gothic edifice of dark stone, its windows like blind eyes staring out into the gloom. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air settled in Marigold's bones. The villagers whispered that this place devoured hope. She glanced at the Duke, whose ice-gray eyes remained fixed on the road. He claimed to be her protector, but as the gates groaned shut behind them, Marigold wondered if she had merely been captured by a more dangerous beast. The great oak doors of Corvane Manor swung open, revealing a cavernous entrance hall that seemed to swallow the light. Marigold stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the checkerboard marble. The interior was a study in contradictions. Shafts of afternoon sunlight pierced through the high clerestory windows, creating pools of warmth on the floor, yet the corners of the room remained shrouded in stubborn, unnatural shadow. As she was led through the corridors, Marigold's trained eye, honed by years of managing her father's crumbling household, noted the heavy Gothic Revival architecture. The manor was designed to intimidate, with vaulted ceilings and pointed arches that drew the eye upward into darkness. She observed the rigid separation of space typical of such grand estates, where green baize doors concealed the labyrinth of service wings from the family's private quarters. Yet the usual hum of a well-managed estate was absent. There was no bustle of housemaids polishing the wainscoting, no footmen standing at attention. The silence suggested a house running on a skeleton crew, prioritized only for survival rather than splendor. It was a house in mourning, much like the man who owned it. She found the Duke in the library, a room smelling of leather and old ash. He stood by the fireplace, staring into the cold grate. Marigold did not wait for an invitation. "I am not a guest here, Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear, "and I am not a fool. You did not save me from Sir Reginald out of charity." Alaric turned, his face half-shadowed. "Charity is a luxury I cannot afford, Lady Marigold." He moved toward her, the predator surfacing once more. "Beaumont destroys everything he touches. He covets you as a prize, a symbol of his legitimacy. By taking you, I deny him that victory. You are the weapon I will use to bleed him dry." Marigold recoiled at the blunt cruelty of his words, realizing she had merely traded one cage for another. "I am a person, not a pistol to be aimed," she whispered. For a fleeting moment the ice in Alaric's eyes cracked. His gaze drifted past her, focused on some invisible ghost. "I know what it is to be used by him," he murmured, his voice rough with a buried agony, "to be hollowed out until nothing remains but the need for retribution." In that instant, Marigold saw not a monster, but a man haunting his own life, driven by a grief so profound it had turned to poison. He dismissed her before she could press further, and she was shown to a guest room in the west wing. Night fell heavy and suffocating, the silence of the manor pressing against her ears. Marigold lay awake, watching the moonlight trace patterns on the ceiling, her mind racing with escape plans. But just as sleep began to drag her under, a sound tore through the stillness, a high, piercing wail of pure anguish echoing from the forbidden corridors of the east wing. It was a cry too human to belong to the living, and too broken to belong to the living. Marigold sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was not alone in the dark. Thunder rattled the leaded panes of Corvane Manor, drowning out the drumming rain that lashed against the stone walls. Guided by the flickering light of a single candle, Marigold hurried toward the source of the anguished cries, her nightgown trailing on the cold floorboards. She pushed open the heavy oak door at the end of the east wing to find a scene of heartbreak. A slight woman with matted blonde hair, Elowen, cowered in the corner of a four-poster bed, clawing at the air as if fighting off invisible phantoms. Alaric stood beside her, his imposing frame rendered helpless by his sister's terror. "She burns with fever," Alaric rasped, looking up as Marigold entered. His mask of stoicism was gone, replaced by raw desperation. "She sees him in the shadows. She thinks he has returned for her." Marigold didn't hesitate. She set the candle down and moved to the bedside, her presence a calm anchor in the storm. She took a basin of cool water and wrung out a cloth, gently pressing it to Elowen's flushed forehead. "He is not here," Marigold whispered, her voice steady and rhythmic. "You are safe, Elowen. The gates are locked." As Elowen's thrashing subsided into whimpers, Alaric sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "Beaumont did this," he confessed, his voice low and bitter. "He courted her to get to my father's shipping routes. When she discovered his fraud, he didn't kill her. He did something worse. He threatened to have her committed to Bedlam for female hysteria." Marigold chilled, recognizing the terrifying weight of that threat. In their world, the line between a woman's rightful anger and a medical diagnosis of insanity was drawn entirely by men. A husband or father needed only a signature to vanish a troublesome woman into the horrors of an asylum, stripping her of voice and freedom under the guise of moral treatment. Beaumont had weaponized the era's medical misogyny to shatter Elowen's mind without ever lifting a hand. "He broke her spirit so she could not speak," Marigold said softly, realizing the depth of the Duke's vendetta. "He made her silence the price of her freedom." Hours passed as the storm raged and waned. Finally, Elowen's breathing deepened into a peaceful sleep. Marigold stood, her back aching, and found Alaric watching her. The ice in his eyes had melted into something warmer, a look of profound gratitude and dawning respect. He reached out, his fingers grazing hers as he took the damp cloth. The touch was electric, a sudden spark of connection in the gloom that promised something more than just an alliance. But with Beaumont's shadow looming over their fragile peace, imagine the fear if you don't subscribe now to uncover how they fight back. Those who hesitate lament in the comments why you'd risk missing the Duke's fierce protection. What alliance will they forge next? The library at Corvane Manor had become a war room, the heavy oak table buried under mounds of seized correspondence and shipping manifests. For 2 days, Marigold and Alaric had worked in a feverish synchronization, fueled by stale tea and a shared burning hatred for Sir Reginald Beaumont. Marigold sat amidst the chaos, her finger tracing a line of ink with the precision of a surgeon. "Here," she murmured, tapping a faded ledger. "The numbers do not lie, Alaric, even if the man does." Alaric leaned over her shoulder, his proximity sending a warmth through her that the dying fire could not match. "What do you see?" "Look at the discrepancies between the port of entry logs and his warehouse inventory," Marigold explained, her voice gaining strength as she slipped into the familiar comfort of arithmetic. "In the textile trade, raw cotton yields a predictable amount of finished cloth, but Beaumont's mills report 30% less output than his import volume suggests." She pulled another sheet forward. He isn't just a tyrant, he is a smuggler. He is diverting the excess raw material to the black market to bypass the excise duties and hide profits from his shareholders. It is a primitive form of money laundering, easily missed unless one cross-references the Custom House declarations against his internal production rates. He is robbing the crown to fund his empire. Alaric stared at the papers, then at her, with a look of dawning wonder. I spent years trying to find a weakness in his armor, searching for a scandal or a witness, he said, his voice rough with admiration, and you have dismantled him with simple arithmetic. My father taught me that men can be charmed, but ledgers must be balanced, Marigold replied, a sad smile touching her lips. It is the only power a woman is permitted to manage the household accounts. Beaumont never feared a woman who could count. The air between them shifted, charged with a sudden, undeniable gravity. The distance of rank and circumstance evaporated, leaving only two souls united by the scars of the same enemy. Alaric reached out, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that belied his strength. "You are no mere accountant, Marigold," he whispered. "You are the storm that will drown him." He leaned in, and Marigold met him halfway. The kiss was desperate and searing, a collision of grief and newfound hope that tasted of salt and ink. For a heartbeat, the haunted manor felt like a sanctuary. But the moment was shattered by the thunder of hooves on the gravel drive outside. Alaric pulled away, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the sword resting against the desk. He moved to the window, peering through the heavy velvet drapes. "Redcoats," he cursed, the ice returning to his eyes, "and a magistrate's carriage." Marigold's blood ran cold. These were not Beaumont's hired thugs. These were soldiers of the Queen. The law had arrived at Corvane Manor, but it had not come to serve justice. It had come to siege it. The heavy doors of the manor groaned open, not in surrender, but in defiance. Alaric stood on the threshold, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, while Marigold stood unflinching at his side. In the courtyard, the torchlight illuminated the red coats of a dozen soldiers and the sneering visage of Sir Reginald Beaumont. He held a rolled parchment aloft like a weapon, the seal of a local magistrate glistening in the firelight. "Arrest him for abduction and theft of property," Beaumont commanded, his voice dripping with triumphant malice, "and retrieve the girl. She is a flighty thing who has forgotten her place." The captain of the guard stepped forward, hesitant to lay hands on a peer of the realm. "Your Grace, Sir Reginald holds a warrant. The magistrate in York has signed it." "A magistrate whose debts Sir Reginald likely paid only yesterday." Marigold's voice cut through the tension, clear and piercing. She stepped forward, holding not a weapon, but the damning ledger she had deciphered. "Victorian law may favor the man with the deepest pockets, Sir Reginald, but it does not look kindly on those who defraud the crown. A warrant bought with bribery cannot shield you from a charge of high treason against the excise office." Beaumont's smile faltered. "The ramblings of a hysterical woman. No court will hear you. You are a minor, and my contract holds." "But I will be heard," a voice called from the shadows behind the soldiers. Mr. Llewellyn, the agent who had been discarded in the mud days prior, stepped into the light. He looked at Beaumont with the cold calculation of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. "I have witnessed the falsified manifest, Captain. I can testify to the smuggling rings operating out of the Manchester mills. And," he added, his eyes narrowing, "I can speak to the peculiar shipments of arsenic that never reached the dye works." The air in the courtyard shifted instantly. In the legal hierarchy of the era, a charge of defrauding the revenue took precedence over civil disputes of marriage contracts. The captain's demeanor hardened. He turned from the Duke to the industrialist. "Sir Reginald, evasion of Her Majesty's customs is a non-bailable offense. I must ask you to surrender your arms." Beaumont roared in outrage as irons were clamped around his wrists, his veneer of civility shattering. As he was dragged toward the carriage, he twisted back, his eyes locking onto Marigold with a venomous promise. "You think you have won, girl? You have only ensured your own ruin. The scandal of this night will be printed in every broadsheet from here to London. You will be branded a fallen woman, unfit for marriage, unfit for society. No court can save you from the court of public opinion." The carriage rattled away into the night, taking the threat of violence with it, but leaving a heavier silence in its wake. Alaric turned to Marigold, his expression stark. Beaumont's final weapon had landed. In a society governed by reputation, Marigold had saved her life, but sacrificed her future. The victory was ash in their mouths, for while the villain was chained, the societal chains around Marigold had only tightened. How could love survive when the world would demand her exile? Sir Reginald Beaumont's trial was swift, a spectacle of justice that thrilled the London papers. The Crown, unforgiving of those who tampered with its revenue, sentenced him to transportation for life. He was shackled and cast onto a ship bound for the penal colonies of Australia, his industrial empire dismantled brick by brick. Yet, as the gavel fell, the societal verdict on Lady Marigold hovered like a guillotine blade. She was the woman who lived unwed under a duke's roof. In the unforgiving calculus of Victorian morality, she was damaged goods. In the quiet of the Corvane library, Alaric laid a pouch of coins and a letter on the desk. "I have arranged a cottage for you in York," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth she had come to crave. "You can live there as a widow. It is the only way to salvage your reputation. You will be safe from the whispers." Marigold looked at the letter, then up at him. She saw the wall he was rebuilding, the noble martyr protecting her from his own darkness. She reached out and tore the letter in half. "I did not fight a tyrant and defy my father to live in hiding, Alaric. I do not want safety. I want a life." "I am a man haunted by ghosts," Alaric warned, stepping closer, his resolve fracturing. "I can offer you protection, but my name carries its own shadows." "Then let us face them together," Marigold replied, stepping into his space. She took his hand, placing it over her heart. "The law says that a wife's legal existence is suspended, incorporated into that of her husband. It is a system designed to make women disappear. But with you, I do not vanish. I become armor. I choose to bind my fate to yours, not as a possession, but as a partner." They were wed in the private chapel of the Manor as the first snow of winter began to fall, burying the gloom of the past. It was a quiet ceremony, yet it thundered with defiance. In speaking her vows, Marigold reclaimed the agency the world had tried to strip from her. Years later, Corvane Manor was no longer a place of silence. The corridors echoed with the laughter of 3 children and the soft piano music played by a recovered Eloin. The shadows had been chased away by Marigold's management and Alaric's devotion. The estate thrived, not on fear, but on the prosperity of a family united. Marigold had navigated the treacherous waters of a society that sought to own her, finding her liberty within the very institution meant to constrain her. But don't let fear of missing such triumphant endings grip you. Subscribe without a second thought to ensure these stories reach your heart. If not, head to the comments and wail about why you deny yourself this joy. And in the end, was Marigold's choice the dawn of true freedom?